Well, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for making what has already been a very interesting weekend. So the central assertion of my book, Children of Rus, is that it's in 19th century right bank Ukraine, not in Russia, that Russian nationalism assumes its most potent form. I argue that it's in the Ukrainian lands, not in Russia, that the idea of a Russian nation as a unified Orthodox civilization with a world historical mission to fulfill first takes shape. That it's in Ukraine that Russian nationalists first managed to assemble political followings and to build parties, and that it's Ukraine that directs the first formal efforts to nationalize the Tsarist empire. And by that I mean they're trying to alter organs of governance in order to give more power to East Slavs and to diminish the powers enjoyed by other ethnic groups. And to those of you who know something about 19th century Ukraine, which I assume is all of you, these assertions probably sound surprising and startling. There's been no dearth of scholarship on nation-building processes in the 19th century Ukrainian lands. There's a huge literature on the Ukrainian national movement that many of us, I know, have read. There's also a large literature on Russification efforts undertaken by the imperial authorities. And Russification is usually spoken of as an arbitrary, top-down, heavy-handed effort to promote the language and culture of the great Russian center at the expense of those of the periphery. I'm talking about something else altogether in this book, and this is a third way between these two extremes of Ukrainian nationalism and bureaucratic Russification. And I call this third way the Little Russian idea. And I want to immediately, I already saw some ears perk up with this phrase. I want to clarify because the term Little Russian has taken on a rather pejorative meaning. That's not the sense in which I'm speaking about it. In fact, this is a term that my actors themselves use and that they use with pride. They identify as Little Russians. What does this mean to be a Little Russian? The protagonists of my book were men today whom we today would identify as ethnic Ukrainians. Many had even been raised speaking the Ukrainian language. They were proud local patriots who honored the unique language and culture of their homeland. Yet they also firmly insisted that Ukraine was an integral part of a larger East Slavic civilization that was then ruled by the Tsarist regime. Or even that this local culture in Ukraine should be seen as the purest manifestation of the Russian nation, the Russian spirit, rather than a sort of separate national entity. So this Little Russian idea, it turns out, served as the basis for a Russian nationalist mass movement that would gradually coalesce in Ukraine and would sweep the entire region by the early 20th century. So I can't give a full summary of the book, a full explication of my argument in this very brief time that I have, but I will walk you through my major arguments and then also how I reached these conclusions. I argue that a massive and very important Little Russian lobby has been hiding in plain sight in Ukrainian history all this time. And there are a number of reasons for the absence of historical interest in this group and this movement in the past, but I think the most important is the way that we tend to think and write about nations. The constructivist school of nationality studies, which was pioneered by Benedict Anderson, has now effectively overturned the once conventional primordialist wisdom, right? To be a constructivist is no longer controversial at all in most settings. Anderson helped us see that nationalism is in fact a very modern construct that relies on modern culture and modern infrastructure to spread. Yet there's also a way in which this constructivist approach tends to naturalize the nation, tends to treat it as an inevitable development of modernity. And in asking how a group reaches consciousness, as Anderson and other constructivists do, some of this literature, I would argue, takes it for granted that a group is actually a group. And so influenced by Rogers Brubaker, as well as a new literature that's emerged primarily out of the East Central European field, I try to step away from this assumption and to ask how a group comes to perceive itself as such in the first place. So in other words, instead of analyzing the competition between these bounded and self-evident Ukrainian and Russian nationalist projects, I'm doing a close reading of what actors in this story are actually saying, how they're talking about themselves, and how they define what demarcates a Russian from a Ukrainian in the first place. I tell this cognitive history of nationalism in Ukraine in 3 registers. The first section of the book is an intellectual history. It deals with how elites define groups in this very complex and multi-ethnic region. 2 ideas come to form the basis of the Little Russian idea. The first is the notion that Ukraine, by virtue of its ties to Kiev and Rus, is the natural center of Orthodox civilization, the place where all of these ideas, all of these practices were first invented and developed. And the second component of this Little Russian idea is the notion that the Orthodox East Slavs, and I'm calling these people the children of Rus as a sort of shorthand, that these Orthodox East Slavs are the rightful owners of Ukraine. So by extension, this way of thinking presents the non-Orthodox inhabitants of the region, of which of course there were many, as interlopers who have no right to live on this Rus land. And just to clarify, we're speaking primarily in the right bank about Poles and Jews. So I see this Little Russian idea as the driving force of local intellectual life from the early modern period until the 19th century, and I trace this through in great detail how this idea coalesces. I argue that this Little Russian idea, in fact, is first tested and first begins to develop in Khmelnytsky's campaigns of the 17th century. I then trace how it's further consolidated in the intellectual and cultural work of hetmanate elites in the 18th century, and then how it reaches its apogee in the mid-19th century in the works of scholars like Kostomarov, Kulish, Antonovich, and Drahmanov. Now, of course, all of these actors who I've just mentioned, Cossacks, hetmanate elites, 19th century intelligentsia in Ukraine, these men are commonly thought of as Ukrainian national awakeners, and indeed, they go on to make very important contributions to the Ukrainian national idea. But I argue that at the same time, their contributions are somewhat more complex than we might assume. Because although these figures were very proud of local traditions and they all wanted to preserve local autonomy, some even had critiques of the imperial regime and where it had gone wrong, none of them were in fact advocating a full-fledged Ukrainian nationalist agenda. And in fact, what many of them were insisting that what made Ukraine so special was that it was the very center of this large Rus East Slavic civilization, which by necessity included Great Russia. And in fact, at key junctures, the bureaucratic imperial state sponsored this strange form of local patriotism, which officials saw as aligning with their own interests at many junctures. So the bureaucratic interests in Ukraine at this point involve promoting orthodoxy in the region, a region that had a lot of Catholic influence as a result of the Polish nobility that had been in place there, and also minimizing the influence of non-Orthodox minorities. In the late 19th and early 20th century, this Little Russian activism became only more intense and powerful. And the second part of the book turns to how the Little Russian lobby used urban concerns, focused on the city of Kiev, to spread this message further down into society. In other words, to get their ideas out of this constellation of elites and down to the people. Activists seized on the urban challenges that late imperial Kiev faced, and these challenges included massive income inequality, major public health problems, and corrupt governance. And they gradually worked these concerns into a narrative that presented the Rus people as perennial victims at the hands of these foreign interlopers, again speaking of Poles and Jews here. So the argument was that these problems could only be resolved if non-Orthodox populations, in essence, lost their power and lost their local foothold in society. The third section of the book turns to popular politics in the 1905 period. It shows how Little Russian activists spread their ideas through electoral agitation, so how they go into peasant communities and begin to organize and mobilize people. It also examines how they worked with the church. And as a result of this agitation, these activists managed to claim many of the local offices in the right bank. There is, by this point, some electoral infrastructure in place, and these sort of Little Russian nationalists do very well in these elections. I also trace how these activists use violent rhetoric and actions to advance their idea. So these activists play a key role in inciting a very deadly pogrom in Kiev in 1905, and they're also involved in fabricating the Baylis affair of 1913, in which a local Jew is charged with a blood ritual murder. And both of these events, I argue, the pogrom and the Baylis case, are predicated on the notion that Jews posed an active threat to these children of Rus. And indeed, they're both essentially propaganda efforts, right, to try to show the people the threats that Jews supposedly pose. By the early 20th century, though, there is a slippage in this rhetoric. These Little Russian activists who I can trace for decades how they've been carrying out this product, they're increasingly describing themselves simply as Russians. And this is a term that for them really denotes their opposition to liberal ideas, to the revolution of 1905, and to Polish and Jewish influence. And these men closely work in the 1905 period with the imperial state, which is then interested in reestablishing order after the disarray brought about by revolution. Many of the activists who I trace attain high-ranking positions in the imperial government, and they come to serve as a sort of brain trust for a czarist regime that's increasingly embracing their dream of turning the multi-ethnic empire into a mono-ethnic nation-state. Yet, I stress throughout, there are still these very strong local, Little Russian, Ukrainophile kind of elements to this agitation. So the leaders of this movement remain almost exclusively ethnic Ukrainians. These men are not ethnic Russians. And much of this nationalist agitation in the countryside is, of course, carried out in the Ukrainian language, since it's targeted at Ukrainian peasants. So in one sense, I'm telling the story of this remarkable victory of this nationalist lobby, right? These activists find a way to reconcile local particularities with this imperial superstructure that's advancing this Russifying agenda. These men have great success in shaping hearts and minds across Ukraine, and they also manage to have influence even in St. Petersburg, beyond the borders of their homeland. Yet this apparent nationalist victory in late imperial Ukraine also brings unexpected consequences. I discuss how the radical and violent ideas that this lobby propagates undermines the stability of the empire that it's in fact trying to assist, hastening its collapse. So, for example, one result of this agitation is we have local populations increasingly turned against one another, neighbors who had lived in peace for many decades now seeing each other as enemies. And of course, the street violence, the imperial authorities are very concerned about this element of this activity as well. I also discuss the unexpected evolution of this Little Russian notion itself. So I show in great detail how state sponsorship of this idea was essential to its development and its propagation, but I also show how beginning in the 1870s, this lobby begins to split, giving rise to what we can now identify as the first Ukrainian national movements. So Drahomanov is one notable figure who I trace, who really begins his career in this Little Russian camp, and he ultimately ends up rejecting the lobby, turning against it, and embracing the Ukrainian national project. Khrushchevsky himself, the founder of the Ukrainian nation, has an interesting connection to this Little Russian lobby. His father was a very hardcore activist who's sent into parts of Poland in the 1860s, trying to convert Poles to Orthodoxy. So the father is working, he's an imperial bureaucrat promoting this Little Russian idea, and of course the son then becomes the founder of Ukrainian historiography and eventually the Ukrainian political nation. So we can trace how individuals over the course of their lives change ideas, change nationalities, as it were. And we can also trace how families with the same DNA make very different choices about who they are and to whom they belong, what they stand for. With some interpreting local culture as purely Russian and others coming to see it as, of course, Ukrainian. And in the end, as these two outgrowths of the Little Russian idea, as they compete, they gradually strive to write each other out of history. So I think this is another reason why it's been very difficult for historians in the past to sort of excavate this identity that's been lost. Ukrainian nationalists erase their own participation from the Little Russian lobby, as well as their participation with the Tsarist state and the ways in which the state helped to promote the ideas that they advanced. And Russian nationalists take an ever more radical stance on this Ukrainian question, gradually insisting that the Ukrainian nation doesn't even exist, that it's an invention of sort of foreign interlopers. This is the language that they use. So I've given you an overview of the kinds of arguments that I make and this local ecology, political ecology that I try to reconstruct. But I just want to close by zooming out and asking, what is the takeaway? Why do we care? And what contributions do I want this to make to Ukrainian studies? I really want this story to prompt us to rethink how we conceptualize the role of Ukraine in the Russian Empire, first of all, and then also in the modern world. At least from the Russianist perspective, Russian historiography tends to treat Ukraine as a periphery. And on top of that, it often invokes this language of backwardness, of underdevelopment. The idea is that things that are happening in the Russian Empire are not happening in Ukraine, right? It's happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg. By contrast, I'm arguing that both of these are really serious misconceptions, that what's happening in Ukraine is absolutely, completely central to what's happening in late imperial Russia, to all the most important ideas about the imperial regime and also then about national ideas that we have coming forward. And furthermore, I'm arguing that what's happening in Ukraine is not backward, it's actually the vanguard of imperial politics. And let me just unpack both of these points very briefly. I show in this book how incredibly complex this Ukrainian-Russian encounter is in the 19th century. Identities tend to evolve in complex and often nonlinear ways, and the story I'm telling is one in which various types of identity, linguistic, ethnic, religious, national, ideological, they don't necessarily always neatly line up. But what everyone in my story agrees, these little Russian protagonists and the imperial regime who supports them, all of them agree that Ukraine is completely central to the Russian nation. In other words, they say, if there's no Ukraine in Russia, there's no Russia. And I'm not arguing that this is good. I'm not arguing that this is right. I want to clarify that in no way am I justifying this kind of Russian nationalist claim on Ukraine. But I think it's a really important force in imperial politics. And indeed, unfortunately, it's an idea and a force that we're still dealing with today and that we're still having to try to decide how to respond to. Then finally, I want to close by discussing the very modern nature of these little Russian politics. The anti-liberal Russian nationalism that emerged from 19th and early 20th century Ukraine was certainly disturbing by our standards today. It had ideas that we reject, we don't like, but it was not reactionary. The social mobilization and the electoral campaigns that were happening in early 20th century Ukraine were light years ahead of what was happening in the rest of the Russian Empire politically and socially. And so were the violent mass politics and the sort of racial fantasies that accompanied a lot of this rhetoric. I suggest that these ideas help to precipitate the collapse of the old regime. In other words, that 19th century Ukraine and the kinds of experiments happening there created forces that the Tsarist Empire could not contain. But I think we'd be wrong-headed to believe that these ideas simply disappear, evaporate after the Tsarist regime's collapse. And so I talk about in the epilogue how this witch's brew of sort of anti-liberal populism that's forged in Tsarist Ukraine, how this remains behind and continues to shape political legacies after the collapse of the Tsarist regime. And in fact, I think that the story that I'm telling here is sort of a prelude to the last panel that we had, this remarkable violence, astounding levels of violence that we see in Ukraine after and during this revolutionary collapse. I also trace in the epilogue how these ideas forged in 19th century Ukraine travel abroad. So many of the protagonists of the book, the men who were longtime Little Russian activists who become Russian nationalists, they're forced to flee into emigration after the Bolsheviks take control. Most of them go to Central and Western Europe. And I trace the role that these Ukrainian Russian nationalists, as it were, play in developing early fascist movements in exile and immigration in the 20s and 30s. So this book is arguing that Ukraine plays a crucial role in the end, in the collapse, the end of Russia's 19th century, right? In bringing about the collapse of the Tsarist regime, we're closing one era. But I argue that we're also opening, in this book, the beginning of a new era. We're opening the 20th century in Ukraine for Russia, and this is, of course, a century that will bring unprecedented violence and political extremism. So I will stop there and await